So there we go.
I just need to do something on my side, otherwise I can't operate my machine. 1 second. Got it.
Great.
I've learned the hard way. If I don't perform a little action there, then I can't mute and do anything. But I have to say, got it, and then I can drive my machine. So thank you, Lucille. It's so nice to be here. I'm so enjoying working with you the last couple of, in what we have done. So I know a couple of names. I'm not sure if people would remember me. Joe Hobson, you and I have never actually met, but I know your name because I'm a Rotarian, and I think you're from Claremont. Am I right?
I don't know if Joe's in a place where she can speak. She often does this from cars and from hotel rooms.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, it doesn't matter.
Not sure if you can hear me.
Now we
can. You hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm driving back from a client and I'll be back in my office in 5 minutes. But yes, absolutely. Very nice to be on the call with a fellow Rotarian. So we haven't actually met, but we should have because we are in neighboring Rotary clubs.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, and there's another reason why I might not have mentioned the Rotary thing, but before I start, I mentioned that I'm blind, just in case any of you didn't know, and which means that I use the laptop using screen reading software, which works very, very well as a rule, but there are always going to be little glitches, and I know for a fact one of the glitches is getting into a breakout room. So I've actually got to be forcibly thrust into the room rather than to be able to get in there myself. It's just a glitch between the screen reading software and Zoom. So I'm a diversity practitioner. I had a long career in marketing of HR products, which is how I got to meet Lucille, because I knew her father very well 100 years ago. And in '99, I began to run my own business in marketing, learning and development, leadership, consulting. And so I was the marketer, and I found consultants work, and the companies. I knew a lot of companies, and I was the only man in the world who actually get money out of consultants, because because the companies paid them and then they paid me com. And then I discovered disability because it was an adjunct to not an adjunct, it was included in the Employment Equity Act. And as the third designated group. And so I started specializing in disability equity, and the rest is history, really. I've been doing that now since '99. I have particular feelings around disability equity, quite strong feelings. I have a presence on the web. You can find me at www.disabilitydesk.co.za. I have a YouTube channel. I've written a great deal about the issue, which is a very not exploited, what's the word, examined area. There's a lot of surface level attention paid to disability equity. I'm a little cynical of the way that disability has been thrust into DEI, and I'm just about to actually release it'll probably come out tonight, a blog on that exact subject, no detail, but just questioning the thing. So I'm a thinker. I suppose you could call me an analyst, a disability equity analyst. And that's about it. Oh, and the last thing I wanted to say, which is why I mentioned Joe, was I joined Rotary quite recently. And because Rotary is quite interested in vocation, I have a very unusual vocation, because diversity practitioners, I'm sure those of you who know about diversity will know that when people say, what do you do? And I say, I'm a diversity practitioner. 9 times out of 10, they look at you with a blank face and say, what's diversity? And so when people heard that, I started writing for Rotary, for my magazine at my club, and then Rotary Africa picked it up, and then Rotary International picked up some of my articles. You can see them all on the site. And then I got invited to be part of the Rotary International Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Task Force. And so I have a role to play to help Rotary, which is an enormous the world's biggest NGO, of course, to help Rotary literally become more diverse. But I'm waving the disability flag. And that's enough from me. And so I'm really looking forward to spending time with you guys this afternoon.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jeremy. And I think as we get started, what would be really lovely is for you to just type in the chat box where in the world you're located. So just give us a city and a country. I know often we are here across many different geographic locations. And if you want to add just very briefly, a sentence or so around why it's important for you to be here today, that would be great. And then from there, as we normally do with our supervision sessions, we'll do a bit of a check-in in smaller groups and get to dive into the topic. Yeah, so where in the world are you at this point in time? Give us your location and anything you want to say up front around why it's important for you to be here today. Welcome back, Alistair. I assume you've dropped off and come back in. Can you hear us now? Great. Thanks, Alistair. Right, so where in the world are we? Just pop that in the chat box. And why is it important for you to be here today? So Rebecca's here from Washington, DC. She's a coach who has MS and she's adjusting daily to changing abilities. Christo's here from Joburg. He's here because he really doesn't know anything of note in this domain and wants to learn and understand more. Maya's here from San Francisco in California. She's trained as training as a therapist. And she's worked with people dealing with losing their visual sight, and it's a topic near and dear to her.
Oh,
so welcome,
job.
Maya. Yay. Let's hear from the rest of you. And Rebecca's saying she also supports people with chronic conditions. Alistair is here from Awareness. He hardly pays attention to this topic. And Alistair, you're in Cape Town. Yeah? Great. Hugh is here. He's in Joburg. He has a brother who's in the process of losing his sight. Jeremy. Andrea's here from Cape Town. She's here because she feels she's out of touch with the lived reality of people who live with disabilities. Anne's here. She says, hello, Jeremy. And she remembers you. You've met many moons ago when you were with Renaissance. She lives in Cape Town.
I remember you, Anne.
And looking forward to learning about the disability world and coaching. And Nick is tuning in from Cape Town. So he's newer in this community. Welcome, Nick. It's wonderful to welcome you here to experience the space, join, participate in the conversations related to coaching. Kanisa is here from the Eastern Cape, from Alice, close to Fort Hare University, and she has family with disabilities. She's here to heighten her awareness. So it seems like there's a lot of personal interest in the topic. So some people here to build awareness, and some people because it's part of their personal lived realities or of people that they work or have as friends and family. So thank you so much, everyone. So this is the interesting thing for me. I just have to confess to this, and I don't know if you had this thought as well, Jeremy. When we put the topic out there, one of the thoughts that I had is, I wonder if people are going to show up for this topic. In particular, because in diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we say that, just shorthand DE&I, often disability is the kind of black sheep, the cousin that comes last, in particular because race and gender is so much more in the forefront, and in South Africa also things around xenophobia. I don't know, is this something that you experience often?
Well, it's interesting, you know, in the old days, I used to joke and say, if you want to empty a room in a conference, just have one on disability. And, you know, what would happen in the old days was if you did have a seminar, a conference, something like that, companies would send their people with disabilities, which of course, it's great, thank you, that's wonderful. But the people we really wanted there in order to learn were those people who manage people with disabilities. And so the point is often missed. And so, yes, people I found, but what I have noticed is that there appears to be an appetite, which I find amusing. I'm after 23 years of doing this, that there appears to be an appetite to learn more and to embrace the subject more. So things are changing. So I did think of that too. And I wonder, maybe I can ask you, since we're being so honest about this, is this the amount of people you would have expected in this group, or is it less?
It's a little bit less than we often have, but it's not significantly less than we have.
Okay,
we
cool.
Often, sometimes we're on some topics, we're up to 30, 40 people, but most of the time
Wow.
we're somewhere around 15 people that are here. And today we are 12 on the call. So,
okay, cool.
Yeah, wonderful. So to just get us into the topic, the first thing I'm going to do is to get us into breakout rooms. And in the breakout rooms, I'm going to ask you to just check in with each other around. If you have coached people with living with disabilities, what are some of the common themes that you've heard come up? What are some of the things that people often bring into those spaces if you've coached or worked therapeutically with people with disabilities? And then to also say, and if you haven't, have you coached people who manage people living with disabilities? Do they ever speak about their staff members living with disabilities? Is this something that's come up in their coaching? And if the answer to that is also no, you can maybe just share what are some of the curiosities and questions you've brought into the space. And we'll do this in smaller groups. And then we'll come back into the room, harvest those ideas and get into the conversation. And I'll just give us roughly, I know we can maybe spend a lot of time in the breakout, but we'll do about 12 minutes in breakout. And let me just open some rooms for us. There we go. Let me just, maybe I'm going to recreate this. Sorry, for more people in a room. There we go. Great. So we will get back together here in about 12 minutes. I'm opening the rooms.
And where are you going to put me, Lucille?
I am going to put you in one of the breakout rooms, if that's okay with you, Jeremy. That's
fine. That's fine. Just I won't be able to do anything myself. So
yes,
I'm in
I'll
your
pop
hand.
you in there. I'll pop
Thank
you in
you.
there. There
Good.
we go.
Okay, 3.
So here we are being pulled back into the space. Apologies for the whiplash. Joe is with us from her office now, and Lolly has also joined us from Joburg. So let's just hear, I'm just curious around a couple of the themes or topics that have come up in your small group. We don't have to share the full details, but any important themes that you want to plant into the collective space that's useful for Jeremy and I to be discussing today.
I spoke from the perspective of somebody with an acquired disability who coaches somebody with an acquired disability as well as someone with long-term disability. So we talked about the change in identity, what a shock to your identity it can be to not be able to do things you could previously do. And also looking toward the future. Like what you have this plan and now your body is doing something else. So it's time to figure out a new plan. And related to that, a person in our group had just had somebody contact him about coaching who is becoming disabled and who is like, I don't know what comes next. And we were talking about the distinctions between coaching and therapy. And how to know to stay in your lane, as it were, you know, what are the limits of what I am able to do, both as, in this case, what I believe was an able-bodied coach, coaching somebody with a disability, and the fact that the issues can range so far out of traditional coaching.
Yeah,
I think those
beautiful.
were the big things, but jump in if you remember something else.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. We'll comment on some of those in a moment. So let's just hear from the other groups. Any other themes that you want to bring into the plenary?
Lucille?
Yes, Anne.
Well, we were lucky we had Jeremy with us, so what could be better to fire up the conversation. But what I found really interesting was Jeremy shared with us the definition of disability in the Act. So that was really helpful and unhelpful, actually, because then we were beginning to, it got so broad that, having said, both Kanisa and I both said, not really, we haven't really coached and we haven't been aware of coaching managers. But once we started populating it, and then I took too many liberties and started overpopulating, then you begin to realize that actually you probably have without realizing it. For example, on the spectrum, you know, if you're working with people with some autism and Asperger's, you may not know, and you very likely have coached someone who's got someone with in their team with those kinds of disabilities. So kind of we were, for me, it became really interesting to, so what are we talking about here? With Jeremy, it's much clearer because he can't see, you know, and that's so clear, as he said, and the implications, but there are other lesser obvious or, yeah. So that became a really interesting thing. And I thought the definition was fascinating.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Let's just hear from the third group that we haven't heard from yet. Anything you want to also seed into the plenary? So that would be the group that had Nick, Maya, and Andrea. Anything you want to just pop in there?
One thing that did come up is I remember once being exposed to a disability stimulator for web development. And it just makes me think of how out of touch myself and lots of people are, and just the lived reality of people with disabilities. And so what it basically does is let you see what it's like to be a visually impaired person engaging with a website, and that how developers, you know, should keep that in mind when developing. So that was one thing that came to mind for me. And also then just thinking about the emotional burden that I'd imagine some people living with disabilities might face, having to maybe feel like they need to fit into different spaces.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for bringing that into the space. And so maybe, Jeremy, at this point, a great starting point would be, why don't you share with us the definition of disability? Now, this might differ from different, across different jurisdictions. But let's start with the South African perspective. How do we define disability?
All right, so let me, I have to put a cautionary here, because there's disability in the world of work, and then there's disability in the world, and they're very two different things. So for instance, and I'll start with the other way around first, the broader one, because the United Nations, and I can't recall it exactly, but I can summarize it pretty accurately. So the UN tends to be the benchmark, because we have the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And they were very reluctant to put too explicit a definition down for obvious reasons, because it's a very broad, very complex. I mean, there's all sorts of things getting involved. And essentially what they're saying is that a disability is a person has a disability if they have a long-term or a long-term physical, sensory, or psychosocial impairment that, in conjunction with various barriers, prevent them from accessing facilities along with everyone else in society. Sorry, I screwed up the last part there. But the important word there is that in conjunction with various barriers, prevent them from accessing society along with everyone else. That's very important. Well, our definition in South Africa, which is aligned with the Employment Equity Act, which of course is labor related, says you have a disability if you have a long-term or reoccurring physical or mental impairment that substantially limits your entry into or advancement in the workplace. So it's a horrible long sentence, and most people have glazed over. So I tend to have to unpack it. Now, the important part about this, and I will unpack it, but the important part about it is that you'll notice there that the word barriers doesn't appear. And so it's an imperfect definition, and it's very medical model oriented, really, because I'll break it down. So you have a disability if you have a long-term or reoccurring. That's kind of, I call it the three-finger test: long-term or reoccurring, physical or mental impairment. Now, we don't even like to use the word mental anymore, which shows you how old it is, but physical or mental impairment, that's your second finger, if you like. And then lastly, that substantially limits your entry into or advancement in the workplace. So there's your three-finger test. And you could take a condition. Let's take mine. Long-term reoccurring, sure. Physical and mental, it slips into physical here because it's a physical disability, blindness. Lastly, substantially limiting in the workplace, and the answer is obviously. Regardless whether there's reasonable accommodation and technology or anything, it is definitely substantially limiting. So it's a very simple one. It gets a hell of a lot more complex when you talk about conditions which are, I don't mean to be dismissive, but which are more marginal than the extreme conditions like the big five, physical, visual, etc. But when you have something like, we were talking about in our group, we talk about Asperger's. Now, we never, in the old days, no one really understood the spectrum. And let's be frank, they still don't understand the spectrum, but we understand it a lot better than we used to. And the trouble is we're obsessed about labeling with pop psychology all over the shop. Everybody likes to label everybody else. And so every doctor with a bad bedside manner has suddenly got Asperger's. And now you have to ask yourself, is it reasonable suddenly to attach that label to them from a legal point of view? Because what will happen is that if you did that, you would populate the employment equity requirement, which is 2% of your workforce, quite fast, I suspect. The concern from people like myself and a lot of thinkers, particularly thinkers with quite radical disabilities, is, and then what about us? We've got more complex, more difficult disabilities to accommodate. If we're going to suddenly rush to throw in slightly more marginal conditions, which aren't, and the trouble is that you can see where I'm going here. I'm digging a hole for myself, and we don't want to have to do that. So this is not an easy subject, but I hope that was clear. That unpacks the definition.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I guess one of the things that I think we can start with, just given that it's one of the first things that has come up. Now, not all people who live with a disability have an acquired disability. Some people are born with disabilities. But for you as someone who also acquired the disability over the course of your adult life.
Yes. Well,
talking about a change in identity.
Yeah.
And the process of having to wrestle with what this means for my future and what comes next for me. Wow. If you want to share a little bit of your own experience around what living with a disability means for you at an identity level, and in terms of the way in which you look at your future.
You know, it's a wonderful question. Thank you. And I think from a coaching point of view, it's a really important subject to be unpacked a lot more, because it's a moving feast. On my website, there's not a podcast, well, it's a webinar, that's right, which I did with an academic, a blind academic friend of mine. And we unpacked the story of losing one's vision over time in the workplace. What's the implication? And so I used to call myself, 100 years ago, when I first knew you and your dad, and Anne for that matter, Anne didn't ever meet me. So Anne only ever knew me on the phone. Anne, be honest, did you know I couldn't see?
It was fantastic. We were having a meeting and Jeremy jumped up and said, "Oh, I'll go and get tea for everyone," and rushed off to the kitchen at great speed, prepared the tea, brought it through, put it down, and we carried on with our meeting. I didn't have a clue that you could not see where you were going or what you were doing at all.
See,
and I was only told at the end of the meeting, and I was gobsmacked.
Certainly, I've just remembered that now. But now the point, I've forgotten that we did actually meet in that case. The point here that now that's called passing. So people with disabilities are famous for passing if they can get away with it. And a visual disability is something we tend to want to pass when we're younger. Now, so I used to call myself the blank page between the Old Testament and the New, because at one point I was not blind enough to be blind and not sighted enough to be sighted. And so but it's the moving feast thing, which is very important to remember, is the fact that, and that from a coaching point of view and a management point of view and a supervisory point of view, it's essential that we understand that you can't rest on your laurels because you think you know how to handle this, particularly from a hearing, a reduction in hearing over time, a reduction in sight over time, possible cognitive impairment over time, even physical conditions like MS. MS is muscular sclerosis is a moving feast. Parkinson's disease, another one. And so we must be very conscious that we must never be complacent about what we think we know, and rather default to thinking, you know what, I'm going to default here and say, I really don't know enough, but I'm going to hang in here. And so you go in with an inquiring mind rather than a prescriptive one. So I can't emphasize that enough from a coaching and a management point of view. From a person point of view, I can't think of the word to use. I'm certainly not going to use sufferer, but from the individual that has this issue or condition or whatever you want to call it, it's I haven't released it. I haven't published it. I did a little monologue thing as a podcast, but I never published it because somebody mentioned earlier staying in your lane. And my wife, who is a counselor herself, very experienced trauma therapist, said to me, you're not in your lane here, pal, because I started talking about trauma. And when you lose the little you have progressively, it doesn't matter how tough guy you think you are, that is a level of trauma. Because I'll give you an example. So I could never, even as a little boy, I could never have driven, but I rode a bike. I could never read a newspaper or a telephone book type print, but I could read large print. I could never I couldn't see a person 10 feet away, but I could see the mountain. And then last year, for the first time, I realized I couldn't see the mountain. Those of you who don't live in Cape Town, we have an enormous mountain, which even I could see for 58 of my 59 years. And that was a loss. I've got to tell you, that was a wrench. Looking for my friend that I had used as a lodestar for navigation was no longer there. And so it is a kind of trauma. And if it's badly managed, and unfortunately, just because you have a disability doesn't mean that you're an expert in that disability. Quite the opposite. Very few people actually know enough about the condition they have. And the problem is that there are very few people to ask. No offense to the medical profession, but doctors are the last people you can trust to give you an honest opinion here, because they don't know either. They're technicians. They understand the physical nuts and bolts, but they have very little experience or frankly interest in the actual manifestation of that impairment in the world itself, let alone in the world of work. And so there's very few people to turn to. And so they often blunder around until they find someone. That's just why I do a lot of work with helping people, for instance, who begin to lose their sight. I heard somebody saying their brother is losing his vision, and I'd be very happy to help. I know a great deal. That was me once, still is. I still have a modicum of vision, which is almost worthless now, but it may, when I lose that totally and I become totally blind, and then that too will be a wrench. Possibly. So yeah, so I really can't be honest enough about this. I hope I've said enough. I think I've given you the work to work with.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And I think that is for us here as coaches, and it's something we work with a lot in Aephoria, is working with our clients, knowing that we are always becoming. And when we're working with developmental coaching, you know, often the story is we are becoming in some way, you know, we're seeing more of the world. There's more complexity that we're holding. There's more that we're opening up. And that's not the only kind of identity adaptation that we go through. There are also these wrenches that we go through. And I love the word there, like the wrenching moment of my identity shifting and continuing to shift multiple times in this journey. And it has implications, not just for who I am, but also who I am through my work and how I relate to my work, and how I relate to my professional identity. And that's often where a lot of the people here on this call would be coaching. I know that one of the things that I really on the inside of at the moment is walking the journey alongside my father, who has Parkinson's, and who progresses over time into different ways of thinking about himself and his work identity. And one of the shifts he's gone through is to move away from most group facilitation that he's doing at this point in time because of some of the challenges he has physically, and going back to the therapeutic chair, where it's like, at least I can have my arms on the armrest while I'm doing therapy. And it doesn't look as though I've got alcohol withdrawal when I'm standing in front of groups all the time. And what that means for him, you know, having spent such a large part of his career really excelling in the field of not just facilitation, but large group facilitation, to say I'm pulling back into the one-on-one space. And I guess those are the kinds of implications of the identity shifts that also run alongside changes in physical ability, as an example. Yeah.
Hugh put an interesting note on the chat there, Lucille. Did you read it?
So Hugh says, I wonder if part of the identity also gets impacted by the correlation between acquired disability and experiences of depression. Jeremy, any thoughts that you have around this?
You know, it's being the age I am, you know, the word depression wasn't something you even whispered in those days. And so we had to be tough guys. We had to really muscle it through. And so the last word in our lexicon would have been depression. And I've only really understood it in the last 10 years, I suspect. And there is absolutely no question that there has to be, and I can't put words in people's mouths, you know, everyone's different, but there's no question that that kind of loss has to come with some level of depression. It doesn't have to be clinical, it doesn't have to be medicated necessarily, but there's no question that you're going to have that manifestation. Yeah, no question.
Yeah. One of the interesting things we found many years ago when I was part of a twin study we did in the Enneagram, we wanted to in some way kind of map whether, you know, there is a difference in, you know, the nature-nurture debate. So we had fraternal and identical twins do Enneagram assessments, and we then looked at their trifixes, so highest in each of the centers and their instincts, to kind of see what manifested there. And what we found is that in all the twins, the identical twins that we worked with, the pattern was that the trifix would be the same. So the more Miranda and Miranda they grew up, the more they shared the same Enneagram style, but all of the identical twins had the same trifix, with the exception of the twins where one of the twins experienced huge trauma or disabling injuries, or, you know, acquired a disability through their childhood years. And in those instances, the feeling center type shifted. So that was just such an interesting pattern. So that idea of acquiring a disability impacting at a foundational level on my relationship with my feeling self As some people say, whether consciously or unconsciously, that's part of almost an identity level shift that we saw. And of course, with fraternal twins, they could be anywhere, they're like brothers and sisters on the Enneagram. So that's just maybe an interesting point to pull in there. One of the things that often comes up when we both managing people that live with disabilities, or if we are coaching or working with people with disabilities as well, is the idea of disclosure in the workplace. And I know that this is a tricky subject. Do I disclose if my disability is not immediately visible? Do I talk about it? And there are lots of real fears people have about the impact of that on their career progression, etc. And even in a country like South Africa, where there are progressive laws that invite workplaces to employ people with disabilities, we find that there's very high levels of non-disclosure. In one of the large, very liberal institutions that we work with in higher education, we found that the difference when we did an inclusion index study, the difference between the amount of people with disclosed disabilities that they know about, which was, I think, just under 3% in the institution, and the number of people who reported that they live with disabilities in the study, it was a 4% difference. So 7% of the workforce said, I live with a disability, and we know that it might be a very murky way of defining that. But that shows you how massive the problem is, even in a place that actively promotes disclosure. So in your experience, Jeremy, if I'm working with someone with a disability or managing someone in that category and disclosure comes up, what are some of the things I need to be aware of?
The first one is spurious disclosure. When I hear numbers like 4, 5, 6, 7%, there's a problem. Not to say that there aren't that many people with disabilities, but it's unlikely in an organization. So what's happening is that, and I've seen it happen, when the Employment Equity Act first came out, no one knew what the hell was going on. And so there was a lot of mistakes happen. I'll give you one example. There was a university in this country which decided that they could count everybody who wore glasses. Now think about it, in a university, that's actually quite a high level of people. Now, interestingly, the wearing of spectacles is an actual exclusion in the definition. There are very few exclusions, by the way. There are a few: self-harming, pyromania, kleptomania, various sexual aberration habits are excluded, and one of them is the wearing of spectacles. Because it is suggested that the spectacles are actually quite an accessible form of accommodation, to the point where it's not, when you wear them, it's not regarded. Now the trouble is, this organization counted everybody, and so that's the problem. It's one of the problems. Is I've seen banks do that. I know one of the big banks also thinks it has about 5% of people with disability. That's nonsense. But it's our own fault because we've got such a lousy definition. Anyway, so that's the first thing that I must. It's a cautionary thing. The other one is the big question: do I? Don't I? If I have a okay, I'm sorry. I may have to. I need a little bit of time here to unpack this, because it's really important. Two elements. So the one element is it safe to disclose when I apply for the job? And experience will tell us that, it's okay. I'll put it in another way. If you ask people with disabilities how easy it is to find a job, they'll say, I send my CV out, I apply and apply and I apply, online, paper, whatever. We never get invited to interviews. You ask managers in companies who have to comply with the Employment Equity Act and who are struggling, and you say, how come you don't see any, how come you got so few people with disabilities in your workplace? And they say, we never get applications. Now, there's an old line in a Dire Straits song that says, two men say they're Jesus. One of them must be wrong. So in this context, what gives? So the one crowd say, we send our applications and we never get noticed. The other one says we never see applications. There's a problem somewhere. So there's many barriers there. It could be agencies who are famously poor around disability. It could be AI. climbing in. AI increasingly is becoming suspect in excluding people with disabilities. So that's the first thing. So I at one point in government, for instance, there's a form Z83 which you need to fill in. Do I have a disability? And I openly say to people, don't, because the chances of it landing in the dustbin are actually quite high. So there's that one. Then there's the thing about disclosing if you really have the job and you've got a condition that's, something has happened, do you disclose? And there's the fear thing. So if I disclose, what might happen? Will I lose my promotional opportunity? Might I lose my job? And you've heard me, Lucille, saying on more than one occasion that, and it's a real problem for me, is even in this day and age, people are losing their jobs when they disclose. I know 3 people who have visual disabilities, all of whom are experienced. All of whom are experienced have lost, of these 3, left, were medically boarded. And so there's a real fear out there. And so the one thing I can say, though, is that when a company or an organization has gone to the effort of making themselves what I call more disability confident through awareness and through paying attention to the subject in every possible way, then you'll have a higher level of disclosure.
And so if I'm coaching someone that's sitting with this, should I or shouldn't I disclose? What are some useful themes to explore as a coach? Knowing that I'm in my swim lane, I'm helping you think about your future. Are there 1 or 2 things that you can advise us as coaches to be more aware of?
So I think one of them is, in fact, for coaches to be more aware about the usefulness of disclosure. So disclosure does have some usefulness. I mean, notwithstanding what I've just said about the medical boarding, when you disclose, you are now protected technically from by the Employment Equity Act. And at the same time, the organization is technically required now to pay attention and to accommodate you. So there's a good reason why, because if you have let's say mine, and you'll recall, the managers at the time, well, still are, in fact, of Renaissance Business Associates, were Valerie Morris and Judy Becker. And so they had to accommodate me as my vision deteriorated. And then we got computers suddenly. The computer suddenly became ubiquitous back in the early 90s. And so there was this big question about, can we as a business afford the reasonable accommodation of the software Jeremy needed to do the job he does? And it was a head scratcher because there was no law in those days to require you. So now, as a coach, it's important that you understand the potentials of disclosure from a security point of view, what's the word? Well, security. You know what I mean? I'm talking about security in the workplace, because there can be, and also the other thing that comes up is understanding the concept of reasonable accommodation, understanding it from a legal point of view, understanding it from what it can do. It's there for a reason. It's not a present or a gift. Of course, it is a gift, but it's a gift in the sense that it allows you very often to be able to be more productive. Certainly the reasonable accommodation I would have needed. And so as coaches, you need to understand the power of that, and also to be able to talk the person through when it's withheld, and to look at options, understand options. What are your options? That sort of thing. So yes, I think it's very important that coaches really get to grips with this issue more than they do, because there's a plethora of things that they can help with, I suspect.
Yeah. One of the things that that you and I have spoken about in the past has to do with what happens in workplaces for managers who are suddenly having to come to grips with someone who is disclosing, who needs reasonable accommodation, and then that quick route that happens in larger organizations, which is refer them on to the employee assistance program. And in your experience, what happens when people living with disabilities are referred on to the employee assistance program, and the newly qualified therapists that have joined those organizations and are working in the sweatshops of, you know, organizational therapeutic support.
That's a real sweatshop, you're right. And thank you. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because it makes them extremely vulnerable. It's not to say that they won't find a wonderful person who could really help, and I'm sure they are, and they are. I have met some. The problem is that when it's outsourced, that organization has absolutely no interest in the employee at all, in terms of what's actually going on in their real employment, which is the company who's the client. And so there's this arm's length thing. There's very little continuity. Very often they switch OTs. And then lastly, the most dangerous part of it is that far too often the practitioner themselves, be they social work, OT, psychologist, even doctor, even lawyer, by the way, are very often not proficient enough in the issue of disability integration or inclusion at every level. I've known doctors, and famously, in fact, it's worth the story, doctors from a organization like that suggesting that the individual leave work because, quite honestly, dear, you couldn't possibly do the job you're expected to do with your poor vision. And it was only because of people like me who actually had to get quite heavy when I heard about this. The trouble is, when we don't, what if you don't tell a guy like me who's got the assertiveness and the knowledge to take them on? And unfortunately, 99.99999% of those cases don't find people like me. And so one of the things that you and I discussed, and it was a terrific idea of yours, was what if, in fact, we could persuade, or we could go into ventures with these outsourced EAP practitioners to, in fact, have more knowledgeable coaches to be able to assist issues like this. So that when an individual with a disability falls into that category and has to be dealt with like that, that in fact there are, so in other words, possibly experienced coaches could form part of those EAP people. There are many ways to skin that cat, but what's needed is knowledge. The common denominator of all the drama that I've unpacked here is lack of knowledge.
Yeah. And so this is maybe a reminder for all of us, and we often talk about the importance of supervision in this space. If you are working with people with disabilities or coaching on the topic, it's useful for you to think about finding someone who does some mentoring or some supervision, who has more direct experience to assist you in that space, to just really come to grips with what it is that's happening in the space. Now, one of the things that maybe here is then another pitfall we can talk about a little bit, has to do with drama triangles and getting into rescuing, persecution triangles in some way, and how that works both for people managing people with disabilities or for us as coaches, what we need to look out for. And also that idea of, I think I heard someone in a talk once call it compassion porn, which is a very radical term, but that idea of in some way wanting to turn conversations into inspirational talks with pictures of flying eagles in the background whenever we bring really hard topics like depression and loneliness and lack of advancement into the space. So your thoughts on some of those things?
Inspiration porn is the term you're looking for there, and it's due to the lack of knowledge, and also the trouble is that there's the I'm just listening to what Rebecca's just posting, but so the very often people with disabilities have been portrayed as the sort of zero to hero type thing. I have overcome that sort of thing, and I mean, we can't knock that. I mean, if you look at a disabled sports person or somebody achieving extraordinary things, that's terrific. That's really terrific. But it can't be assume that that is, in fact, everybody's game and everybody's lot in life. And it misses the point utterly, because we tend to fixate on inspirational porn because it's a little like, there go I, but for the grace of God. And so we can focus on the buzz you get from the inspiration, and you completely overlook the reality of what's happening. And it's not that, I mean, Hugh made an interesting comment earlier. You might want to scroll back and see what Hugh said earlier, was the gifts that people with disabilities acquire when they acquire disabilities through enhanced. Now, I don't want to be cynical, Hugh, but there is a point to what you're saying. You know, I'm not desperate. I hope I don't come across like this negative guy, that disability is so tough. In the world of work, trust me, it's tough. But the individual's experience might be very different, you know, in their private lives. I mean, when you see me in my workshop, when I have one, I don't have one right now, but I'm never happier than when I'm doing woodwork and carpentry, which is very different from the kind of growly, tough guy who has to fight with corporates. And so it's important that we don't look on disability purely as this object of inspiration. Okay, awareness requires that we open our eyes, and to particularly the word inclusion in the DEI acronym is the big deal. And you've got to ask yourself, why is it now, especially in our country? It's very different in more developed countries. But in our country, you have to ask yourself, why don't I see many people with disabilities in the workplace, in tertiary education, in primary and secondary education, and on public transport? And those are the questions you want to ask yourself, because that's reality. And that's why the inclusion element is so important here. So, yeah, so that so, you know, you touched on stuff like the drama triangle and everything. We must unpack that a little. Because of the inspiration, the plethora of inspirational stories and things out there, we tend to look on disability with quite a big degree of pity. And that's a maternal instinct. And so as a therapist, as a practitioner, like a coach or a mentor, and I mentor youngsters, you know, well, not youngsters, I mentor people who lose their vision. And the instinct is, in fact, to rescue. The instinct is to be more maternal. The instinct is to provide the advice rather than draw it out, because that's how we've been brought. This medical model is literally ages old. Literally ages old, uncountable ages old. It's a very hard paradigm to climb out of. Remember, we've been viewing disability as a biological / welfare issue. They cannot do it because they have the disability. Only recently, in the last 50 years, have we switched or slowly clicked into a new paradigm where we're saying, actually, hang on. Very often it's the barriers, both physical and attitudinal, preventing us from or preventing people with disabilities from accessing stuff. And it's hard, especially people of middle age like us. It's hard to unlearn that paradigm. So there's a lot to be worked on here.
And so what happens in the workplace, in your experience, when managers get stuck in some of the rescuing part of the drama triangle?
Okay. Well, remember the drama triangle can only work as a, you know, it's all three things kick in, you know. So you've got in order for the drama triangle to even begin to work or to happen, is by regarding somebody as a victim. Remember, that's the one pinnacle. So if you regard a person as a victim, you're almost certainly going to fall foul of the other two things. Initially, you will rescue. By rescuing, that the possibility of the victim taking you for a ride because you're rescuing is quite high. So that victim very often actually becomes a persecutor. In the disability context, and I've seen it happen, where the rescuing so sophisticated that the individual stops working or stops trying or stops participating. And that is a form of persecution. So now they're persecuting, and now you're the victim because they're doing it to you. And you think, what the hell? I was helping and helping and helping, and they're so ungrateful. And so suddenly your claws come out, teeth come out, you become the persecutor, and now you've had a whole cycle. Yeah. And we see this a lot, particularly in the older paradigm mindsets, the older managers, the older nurses, the older doctors, the older social workers, it's older psychologists. So it's a very dangerous trap. And it all stems from our rather childish attitude towards disabilities because of our lack of experience, because we haven't seen them very often. So when I teach the drama triangle, you can't play that game. So you don't treat the person like a victim. You treat the person like an employee or like a colleague or like a boss even. And you steer away from that rescuing and the persecution. Helping is not the same thing as rescuing.
So at this point, I am going to maybe just open the floor a little bit and invite both comments and questions. What's happening for you as you listen to this conversation between Jeremy and I? What would you like to bring into the space from your own personal experience or from the questions that are bubbling up for you at this point in time? You can just unmute and pop into the space.
I think two things are arising for me. One is just that in my coaching career, what I find is I come across people that are dealing with depression or anxiety disorders, and just the fear about disclosing that and getting support around quote unquote like psychological issues. And then also just my own experience in working with the blind in the past of, I don't know how to say that, like naively not seeing what they are capable of, like being surprised when I was like, oh, you're blind and you paint? Like, how amazing, like, that's so beautiful. And just sort of the vulnerability of being a manager and managing someone with a newfound disability or something that's sort of developing over time. And I was actually a little surprised when Jeremy said there are people that actually assume that they know the path, because I stand in the position of the opposite of just like being like, wow, I so don't know what to do in that situation, Yeah, those are the two things that came up for me.
Thanks, Maya.
Yeah. Joe?
I have two things, and I'm pleased, Jeremy, that you mentioned the Asperger's and autism and autistic spectrum. So in that sense, I come from two positions. So first, my older daughter, who's 25, is autistic, high functioning. So Asperger's is the diagnosis. And as a mom, I find great difficulty in advising her on how to be at work, both in terms of disclosure and in terms of helping people to accommodate her. Her view at the moment is nobody must know because they'll think I'm a freak. I want to say, and I mean this kindly, so please see it in that way, is they already see that you're different. They just don't understand it. But if you give them a label, as much as we don't like labels, I've watched people, as soon as you've got a label, there's some element of understanding and accommodation. So, I mean, there are all sorts of complexities in being a mom and coaching your own children's, but I see how she's limited. She has limited accommodation at work because she doesn't disclose. Linked to that, I had an opportunity to coach a fairly senior person in an organization. And because of my experience with Asperger's, I could see straight away that there was definitely a lot of autistic elements with this person. I was not able to diagnose formally, of course. I was not allowed to label it anything. I was trying to encourage this person to get more information and a diagnosis so that she could explain to her colleagues, this is who I am. and had to just watch from the background it not going very well, because she was impossible at work with all the antisocial behaviors that can come with that, with Asperger's. Was disliked yet highly functional. So I was in that tricky position where the person didn't know enough to disclose. I couldn't disclose. I didn't get to the point of referring to a therapist to get a diagnosis. Anyway, this was quite a while ago, and I think I could have handled it better. But I was curious if anybody else has had a similar experience or been stuck where one has insight but is not able to get it to the point of where it's useful.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Can I comment on that? Because I love that story, Joe. Thank you. So, and that's why that is where disclosure can be beneficial. If one can, and that's one of the jobs I do. So a corporate client will identify somebody who hasn't disclosed, but they know they have a problem. And the other day, somebody growled at me for using the word problem, but you can't keep up. But because they knew they had an issue which they thought might be disabling. And so one of the things they do is they sort of send me in like a secret weapon. Weapon's the wrong word, and I work with that individual to make them understand that disclosure here is actually a good thing. But I will only do it if I'm confident that the company is in fact mature enough to handle it. And it's very important that, because the moment they did disclose, then Joe, you could then have climbed in, because then you would have been allowed to, because then you would have been able to be in an ideal position to assist the reasonable accommodation. But because they didn't disclose, your hands were tied. And so that's why partnering like this is actually really useful. And I've done some of my best work actually once the disclosures happened and I was able to climb in and to work with the company around the, sometimes literally stopping a travesty of justice. I mean, one day I've got a wonderful story which I could tell, but we probably don't have the time. And it literally makes the hair stand on the back of my head. And if I hadn't been able to climb in, it would have ended in tears. And I was only able to climb in because that individual disclosed finally. Anyway, but Joe, that's a really, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that is also part of the process around knowing when to refer and refer confidently as coaches is a really critical piece of this story. Yeah.
Can I come in, Lucille?
Yes, Kanisa.
Jeremy, what does the law say about people who did not disclose at the point of entry, but when the going got tough and they got wound up and then things fall apart? And at the backdrop of, just the organizational culture, but also managers who are unable to see that there is a problem here and refer the people. So is there any protection? Because I mean, I know bullying with my daughter got so much to the point where she regretted not disclosing at the point of entry. But at the same time, she was afraid that she may not be taken as much as she was talented. So is there anything in the law?
Well, the law, so there's a code, and it's the Code of Practice on the Employment of Persons with Disabilities, which is to be read with the Employment Equity Act. And in Chapter 6, it's all about reasonable accommodation. And the opening lines are that you can only be expected to receive reasonable accommodation if you have disclosed. So that's the opening lines on that. Having said that, in another chapter, they talk about you can't force disclosure. And they also say the flip side would be if you don't disclose, then you can't expect reasonable accommodation. So now, so that's the sort of cynical way to look at it. So that's why it's important to disclose. If the wheels come off and then you disclose, the law hasn't an opinion on that. That's too that's just not, there's not enough casework, I suppose, around that, and that, you know, that it hasn't come up in law as far as I know, and I don't know the law integrally at all, but I suspect that couldn't be argued in law easily. Someone saying, yeah, but she only disclosed now. How were we supposed to know? Well, she has now, pal, so suck it up, would be my attitude, and deal with it. There's been damage, so let's deal with this materially and appropriately and control the damage. I'm sure we can come around to something. And so you can I would always make the excuse, well, I'm not surprised she didn't disclose, because it's a toxic environment, frankly. But the moment she does disclose, then the law is on her side. The trouble is, and I want to be really honest about this, is that we don't have sufficient case law in this country, because let's face it, lawyers, labor lawyers or lawyers aren't necessarily well versed in disability related law. You can't go to places like the Human Rights Commission, because they're not actually arbiters of the law. They are there to, or rather they don't give justice, they're arbiters. So it is a little tricky, actually. No, that's a really understatement. It is exceedingly difficult to take complex cases to law. And I'm being brutally honest here, because it's a very, very subjective game after a while. The best way would be to try and work with the organization. And often the lights come on. Oh my God, I didn't know. Oh wow. Okay, cool. All right, let's see, what can we do? And that's the only way. In your daughter's case, it's now too late, sadly. I'm always very sad when I hear the stories of lost opportunities of disclosure having resulted in dismissal or people leaving or whatever. I'm always saddened by any loss of employment due to being poorly handled in the whole complex game of disability, because so much of it, I mean, I remember saying to a guy once, don't allow yourself to be medically boarded. No, I know what I'm doing. And I'll get 75% of my salary if I am. And he cried afterwards, because he absolutely couldn't make ends meet, and he absolutely had burnt his bridges. And there was absolutely no chance, one, of ever returning to that company. And he was a senior man. He was the general manager of a Chapter 9 institution in this country. And two, he was over a barrel, because now he can't seek additional or other work, because he was receiving this pension. So we don't analyze this stuff enough.
So to Maya and Rebecca, I don't want to put you on the spot, but just, I know that you're coming from a very different jurisdiction where there might be a very different way in which these things play out legally. And just for us to understand in the US, how does the law work with some of these things? If you have any input and ideas on that.
So again, as I said earlier, I'm speaking from my experience, and that really is all any of us can do. I worked for a nonprofit library for a long time, and MS, in addition to mobility issues, has also given me excretory issues. We'll leave it at that. And I went to human resources at my company and said, hey, this is an overshare, but it's a necessary one. Here's an issue for me. It would be really lovely if this men's room that only has one stall could be made a unisex bathroom. Within a week, the sign was changed on the door. A couple of years later, I was working for a government organization, so US government, and the doors were too heavy to be easily opened. And it turned out that they weren't up to the Americans with Disabilities Act code. It took 9 months and maybe 20 emails to various people in the organization to finally get those doors changed. So there are laws in place that say accommodations must be made, reasonable accommodations. and how attentive people are to them is certainly inconsistent. And just a thing I want to throw out there for folks to think about when working with the disabled is the exhaustion that can come from having to advocate for oneself relentlessly.
Yes.
Is not to be underestimated.
And so how can we support people who are exhausted from having to advocate for myself?
I think that's a great question. And I think a big part of it is just recognizing, like, that sounds exhausting. Like, that really just, a big part of coaching is mirroring. And I think being able to reflect back to somebody, that sounds hard, like just acknowledging how tough it can be is huge. And then helping people think about what coping mechanisms might be, how they can really take care of themselves especially in these periods of relentless self-advocacy.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. That's really, really useful.
I like that. I'd never thought of it like that. That was so beautifully put, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'd bring into the space, which is really useful, and I think it relates in part to this, is part of it's kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion terminology that's starting to be used a lot more, is how do we build cultures of allyship? And that whole idea that if we are allies to our colleagues that are living with disabilities, then maybe they don't have to do all the advocacy. And that doesn't mean I should rescue or in any way disempower, but to say, what support do you need? And how can I also make noise about this? Is an incredibly powerful role that we can take on in organizations. And in the virtual work, world of work, one of the things that we've worked with in one of our client organizations is, and it does start from the education piece, but really going to a team who has a hearing impaired colleague who does spend a lot of time, she does use some of the text transcription when they were in Zoom meetings together, but she does a lot of lip reading as well. And so just getting the team to build a culture of videos on made such a difference for her, because when they moved to a virtual world of work where everyone experienced more isolation, and I know a lot of people living with disabilities also struggle with isolation, the first thing that started happening is people would come on to early morning meetings and say, sorry, I don't have my makeup on yet. I'm keeping my camera off. And it took quite a lot of her advocacy with her manager before the manager actually heard it properly and started enforcing cameras on. And so that kind of small issue can make such a big difference when we talk about, it's not just reasonable accommodation, it's inclusion as well, in such a big way. And just saying, do I really have to have this explanation coming through to my manager again? Can you get it? Can we just have this conversation and do the accommodation? Yeah. So Maya, I don't know if there's something you want to share.
Well, I was just going to say the word that keeps coming through my mind is empathy, because going back to what Jeremy said, is that I think when we hear these terms, we think that we understand them, but really Rebecca speaking to it is like really just getting inside the person's experience and understanding what it is. There's a line from the movie City of Angels that I love. And one of the actors says, I know what a peach tastes like, but I don't know what a peach tastes like to you. And it's like really, really, really knowing what's it like for that person.
Yeah. So we often talk existential in this group. And Jeremy, when we were preparing, you said we definitely need to talk about isolation and loneliness. for people living with disabilities. And I guess just anything that you want to bring into the space around that for us to consider.
Thank you. And I meant it really in the context of work. I mean, I'm not going to go into what it must be like, for a person with a disability. God knows how awful it must have been for many people during lockdown. But in the world of work, what I meant was about the isolation and loneliness is that because even if you have disclosed, and even if your colleagues ostensibly might be supporting you, there is a level of loneliness because they don't really get the difficulty of, let's say a visually impaired person or blind person using technology. It's a moving feast. Maya, you clearly support people with visual disabilities, and I don't know if any of them have ever spoken to you about some of the challenges around embracing technology, inaccessible websites, software that changes, Microsoft's endless, inexhaustible ability to change things around. Now that creates a loneliness and an isolation, because now you've got a problem. So now you're expected to do a job of work. And last week, you could access that particular menu option in Excel, but this week you can't because it's gone or it's changed. Now, who do you consult? You go to your IT provider in the organization who you're supposed to, and he, through no fault of his or her own, doesn't have the understanding of a screen reader. And so they're now feeling a little impotent because they can't help you. So there's a level of frustration. So your isolation then grows even more. Now you're not only isolated, but you're now nervous because you actually had to put that report using Excel on your boss's desk yesterday, and you still haven't finished it because you can't find that menu item. And so do you see how this can unpack? And it becomes a roller coaster. And so the level of isolation now in the hearing impaired community, and as well as the profoundly deaf community, and I deliberately separate them because there's a great divide between the two, and there's a lot of antagonism between the two groups as well, by the way, and so they have their own separate. So during lockdown, or rather, well, during COVID, when everyone was wearing masks, certainly in our country, we were very good about masks. So we had an extremely high rate of mask wearing in this country, as opposed to other countries who decided to make it a political football. The deaf really struggled because they were absolutely unable to lip read. The hearing impaired, like me, because I don't hear very well either. It's a hangover of the eye problem. The condition I have, RP, I struggled with mask wearing because now everyone's voice is muffled. And so that leads to an isolation. So you know what, I don't think I'm going to come to that meeting because I actually can't hear what's going on. And so, yeah, it's just one of those extra things. Inaccessibility, physical inaccessibility to a person with a mobility impairment is unbelievable, the level of isolation, because they simply can't. I know a man who lives in a tenement, in a poor sub-economic area, and as long as I've known him, he's never left his flat. Because he lives on the third floor, and so everything's taken to him. And so yeah, we mustn't underestimate that. It's yet another little, pencil in the pencil box to take into account. But in the world of work, it's something quite serious, which isn't always understood.
Thanks. So anyone else with a question for Jeremy? We're kind of in the back end of our session. So one or two more questions, and then we'll do a small breakout to just process our learning. But yeah, anyone else who has a question or comment? Joe.
I would like to ask Jeremy a question. So what are the sorts of assumptions or stupidities that people who do not have a disability say or do, where they're perhaps trying to be kind or accommodating, but just get it completely wrong? Because what I've realized is one typically avoids a person with a disability if one doesn't understand, because one doesn't know how to behave. Certainly as a child, I avoided people in wheelchairs because I just didn't know better. Now I make a conscious effort to be a little bit more mature about approaching people with disabilities. But I recognize in myself discomforts which just make me not ignore people, but maybe be less friendly through sheer fear of misunderstanding. So what is your chosen way of people who just actually don't know what to say to approach somebody like yourself or somebody with another disability? Like, what's the daunting stuff that we do that we shouldn't be doing?
Right. So, I mean, it's a hangover of that old medical model paradigm that we've all come out of from ages old. We were told, oh no, don't look at that man, his legs don't work, that sort of thing. Telling a child who's very curious. Anyway, so that hangover has made us reluctant to get too close. If you boil it down, I play a game. Every workshop I run, I play a game, which I call the why game, and it distills down to one word, and the word is fear. Is that we tend to not get close to things that we are not comfortable with and we don't know anything about them. And so we're highly unlikely to walk over to that thing and embrace it. We're more likely to avoid it. And so that avoidance gives us a lack of experience. And then, it just unravels from there. So the way I entice people to get closer is actually to light up their curiosity factor. Don't be frightened to ask. I mean, don't ask, gee, how did you land up in that wheelchair when you've only met them for 30 seconds? That's a little close to the bone. You need to be a little bit more subtle, know them a little longer. I mean, there are people I know many, many paraplegic and quadriplegic people, because I've hung out with them for so long. And there are some people I still haven't asked. And so that's one thing, but that doesn't stop you from engaging. And that's the word I was looking for earlier, is engaging. We need to encourage greater engagement. And and then when you do engage and you feel it necessary to offer, or you're frightened to offer help because in some mythology out there, someone said, oh no, you can't offer them help because they'll bite your head off. It's a complete nonsense thing that, yes, of course, there's the odd person who might do that. But invariably only if you've made a mistake. And the mistake that people make is to proffer help and in fact foist help on to the person without asking first. Then you're likely to get your head bitten off. So the rule of thumb is ask and ask again. So that guy looks like he's going to struggle up that very steep ramp. Can I help you? The individual may say, no, you know what, I actually like using this ramp because it gives me a great exercise for my arms. Or he may say, you know what, I'm not going to make it. Yeah, can you help me? Then you ask again. Even though it's bleedingly obvious what you need to do, ask again, because it empowers them. Otherwise, we are taking the power away. And that's why grabbing a blind person and dragging them across the road is a really, really bad idea, because you're disempowering them. So engaging and asking is the best possible way. Genuine curiosity, not morbid curiosity or toxic curiosity, And there's something I've been learning recently, and thanks to Lucille, is reading the literature on unconscious bias, is the thing about microaggression. And I've only just been realizing now that sometimes the over flippant way that we talk to some of the people we know with disabilities, and I'm not saying, I'm the least politically correct man on earth, and I'm really down to earth to a fault. But I realize now that some of the over flippant, over familiar, casual way that some people refer to, and they joke, and I realize now that's a level of microaggression. They probably don't even know they're doing it, and they would be appalled if they heard me saying it. But I've only just realized that's what it is actually, is that it can actually be quite annoying and destructive, because it's not always your best mate doing it. It could be your boss who's making a flippant remark about the individual with the disability, and they think they're being funny. but actually it's a kind of microaggression. And that's something we're going to have to pay more attention to. And I'm certainly going to have to incorporate that more into my work now. Joe, so a bit of a scramble there. I'm not sure if anything of that was useful.
It was useful. Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy.
Sure.
Yeah. And in my experience, Joe, there's something about just working with the common relationship that we have with all human beings as the basis from which a lot of forgiveness for our insensitive assumptions might come. So the better we get to know people, the more relational currency there is to just say, hey, that was offensive, don't do that again. And so it's about building human relationships. And I will still remember many years ago when Jeremy and I were running a workshop at Grooteskier Hospital. And I remember I turned to Jeremy, we were doing a focus group or something. And I said to him something like, don't you see, Jeremy? And he burst out laughing. And the entire group were mortified by this discussion between the two of us. They were like, what just happened? She's so insensitive. This is it. And we just had I don't know if you remember that, Jeremy, but the group were absolutely mortified.
Yeah. And that's very important. I mean, it may not have sounded like it. I think if I play back some of my stuff tonight, I realized that I must sound like a grumpy old man. And actually, I apply humor a great deal to my work because it's really important as a disarmer is to, in fact, and I'm probably responsible for why people might apply that subtle microaggression, because I downplay the thing a lot and I fool around, and but humor is very important to demythologize. And you must remember, a game like disability inclusion is fraught with mythology and assumptions. There is an enormous amount of garbage out there. One of the elements of my workshop is called reality check, the fact over the myth, because there's such rubbish out there simply based on lack of knowledge. And we must demystify that and demythologize that. And the way to do that is very often humor, and to make people less. Oh, I'll tell you a funny story that happened in our Rotary Club the other night. So we've inducted a quadriplegic. Now, Joe, you'll be pleased to hear. A guy called Anthony Galino, and he's the head of the Quadriplegic Association in the Western Cape. No, you cannot have him. And so we're at the beginning of our Rotary meetings, we light a peace candle. And so it's Anthony's turn now. So in a live meeting for once, instead of a Zoom meeting, everyone's watching Anthony. How the hell's he going to light the peace candle? And he says, I've got a first for this club. I'm going to light this candle with my mouth. Now, he's a high quad. He's got absolutely no movement. He's a tetraplegic. He's got no movement from the neck down. And he says, I'm going to light this candle with my mouth. And there was this intake of breath. And then he turns to his carer and he says, Charmaine, will you please light the candle? So I employ as much humor as I can in every opportunity I can, because it makes them more, the chances are they'll be more amenable to be inclusive with me if they laugh.
Yeah. So just the two things from my friends living with disability that most often they find annoying. The first is when you've just met me and you come to me with, do you know this doctor? Have you tried this therapy? And like the yes. Starting point is that I have some kind of savior out there that's going to save you from your disability. So that is a very annoying one. And the second one is we've known each other for a short bit, and then the next part of the question is, can I pray for you? Ooh. And that also sometimes does not get the best response. So if you are going to withhold some of your instincts, those are the two to just withhold until there is an invitation for that conversation.
Bless you, nice Lucille. Thank you.
So I think what we'll do is we'll just pop into breakouts for a short 7 minutes to just say, what is the most important takeaways that I am taking from today's conversation? And let me just do breakouts for us. I'll do new breakouts for us. Jeremy, do you want to join a breakout?
No, let them break out. You and I can chat while they break out.
Okay, great. So just don't follow the instructions for this. Great. So breakout for 7 minutes and then we'll close off.
I know.
Here they come.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. And yes, so our supervision time with Jeremy comes to an end. Jeremy, thank you so much for bringing your experience, your wisdom, your cynicism, and your humor into the space. Any last thoughts from your side as we end off?
You know, I've said so much tonight, I'm not going to, other than to say I thought this was an amazing space. And I really want to thank you for the opportunity of allowing me to share this with your colleagues. I think it's been terrific. I've loved every minute of it. So thank you, everybody, for participating so openly.
Thanks, Jeremy. And yes, if one or two of you just want to check out, and then we'll call this a great supervision session. So anyone who wants to just say anything to feel complete today, you can just unmute and jump in.
I'll just say thank you so much, Jeremy and Lucille. This has been tenderizing. Yeah, informative and tenderizing. Thank you.
Thanks, Maya. One more comment and then it's a night for us. Yay. So
I just want to add how powerful that phrase was. I know what a peach tastes like, but I don't know what a peach tastes like to you. And as someone who isn't working or living with people who are working and living with disabilities, that's a phrase I really want to sit with and chew on and digest and think about. And so thanks. I can't remember who shared that, but that sharing was so powerful, and I'm gonna sit with that.
Thanks. And Nick, as one of the newer people into the space, hope we'll see you back here again. And yes, please look out for the mails around the next session. Somehow I should have prepared to tell you what Julia will be doing in our next supervision session, but I didn't. So please read the mails when they come through. And thank you so much. Have a beautiful evening, everyone, and see you again soon at supervision. Bye.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Lucille. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, guys. Cheers.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Lucille.